You are standing in a cave 70,000 years ago. Someone across the fire is trying to tell you something urgent. There's danger nearby, or food nearby, or a plan for tomorrow, and they have no words. None. No verbs, no nouns, no way to say there, or tomorrow, or behind the ridge. All they have is their hands, their face, and whatever sound they can force out of their throat. And somehow, from that silence, from that absolute zero, came Shakespeare, came contract law, came you, right now, understanding every single word of this sentence without any conscious effort at all. That gap, from nothing to everything, is one of the strangest problems in all of science. So strange that in 1866, the Linguistic Society of Paris did something almost unheard of in academia. They banned the topic outright. No papers on the origin of language would be accepted, period. Too much wild speculation, too little actual evidence. For over a century, serious linguists mostly avoided the question entirely. It became something of a professional embarrassment to even ask it. So how did humans invent the first language? The honest answer is that we still don't know for certain. But in the last few decades, the evidence has gotten good enough that we can finally make educated guesses. And those guesses take us somewhere far stranger than you'd expect. Let's start with a problem most people never think about. Language isn't just words. A parrot has words. A chimpanzee, trained for years, can learn hundreds of hand signs. What humans have is something categorically different, and the technical term for it is recursion. Linguist Noam Chomsky argued for decades that the defining feature of human language is the ability to embed ideas inside other ideas infinitely. The dog that chased the cat that killed the mouse that lived in the house. You can keep nesting that sentence forever, and a human brain can still parse it. No other species, as far as we've been able to test, can do that. Not chimpanzees, not dolphins, not the very talented parrot named Alex who could identify colors and shapes. Recursion appears to be uniquely human, and figuring out when it appeared is close to figuring out when language itself appeared. The trouble is, language doesn't fossilize. You can't dig up a sentence, so researchers have had to get creative, piecing together evidence from anatomy, genetics, archaeology, and the study of language itself. Start with the body. In 1983, a fossil discovery in Israel gave researchers something they'd been missing for a long time: a hyoid bone. It's a small, delicate, U-shaped bone that sits in your throat, unattached to any other bone, and it's essential for the fine muscle control needed to produce complex speech sounds. The specimen, associated with a Neanderthal skeleton at Blombos Cave and studied by Baruch Ahrensberg and colleagues, was virtually identical to a modern human hyoid. That single bone reignited a huge debate. If Neanderthals had the anatomical hardware for speech, did they also have language? The jury on that is still out, and we'll come back to it. But the hyoid bone told us something important. The physical machinery for complex speech may be older than Homo sapiens itself. Then there's genetics, and this is where the story gets a name most people have actually heard of: FOXP2. In 2001, a research team led by Cecilia Lai and Anthony Monaco at Oxford identified a mutation in the FOXP2 gene in a British family, known in the literature as the KE family, roughly half of whom had a severe inherited speech and language disorder. They struggled to control the fine muscle movements needed for speech and had broader grammatical difficulties. This was the first time a specific gene had ever been directly linked to language ability in humans. The press immediately, and somewhat inaccurately, started calling it the language gene. That's an oversimplification. FOXP2 doesn't single-handedly create language. It's involved in motor control and neural development more broadly, and it exists in some form in mice, birds, and other animals. But the human version of FOXP2 has two specific mutations not found in chimpanzees, and researchers led by Wolfgang Enard at the Max Planck Institute estimated in a 2002 paper in Nature that these mutations became fixed in the human population sometime in roughly the last 200,000 years. That timeline lines up suspiciously well with the emergence of anatomically modern humans.
Here's where it gets even stranger. In 2007, researchers led by Johannes Kraus extracted DNA from Neanderthal remains found in El Cedrón, Spain, and found that Neanderthals carried the same modern version of FOX2 that we do, not the ancestral version, the modern one, which means either Neanderthals independently evolved the same mutation, which would be a remarkable coincidence, or, more likely, this version of the gene was already present in the common ancestor of both species sometime before our lineages split roughly 500,000 to 600,000 years ago. That pushes the biological readiness for language much further back than most people assume. The hardware might have existed long before anyone said a single word. But having the hardware isn't the same as inventing the software. A brain capable of language and a population actually using language are two very different milestones, and this is where archaeology starts to matter more than genetics. One of the strongest indirect signals researchers look for is symbolic behavior. The logic goes like this. If a group of ancient humans is creating symbols, deliberately, consistently, and sharing an understanding of what those symbols mean, that implies a shared system of abstract communication. And abstract, shared, rule-based communication is essentially what language is. In 2018, a team led by Christopher Henshelwood published findings in Nature describing a piece of ochre found at Blombos Cave in South Africa, engraved with a deliberate cross-hatched pattern, dated to roughly 73,000 years ago. It wasn't decoration for its own sake, or at least not only that. It was a symbol, made with intent, and made in a way that suggests other members of the group would have recognized what it was. You don't make abstract marks for no one to understand. Around the same site, researchers have also found shell beads, pierced and worn, dating back over 70,000 years, which imply not just symbolic thought, but a shared cultural code, since beads only function as jewelry or status markers if everyone around you agrees on what they mean. Push the timeline back further and the evidence gets thinner, but doesn't disappear. At sites in Kenya and elsewhere, evidence of long-distance trade in obsidian, a volcanic glass useful for toolmaking, has been dated to roughly 300,000 years ago, associated with early Homo sapiens. Trading anything over long distances requires negotiation. It requires some way to establish trust with strangers, to communicate value, to arrange an exchange. It's difficult to imagine how that kind of trade network functions with only grunts and gestures. It's not proof of full grammatical language, but it's a strong hint that some form of complex communication was already doing real economic work. Now here's a question that tends to surprise people. Did language appear suddenly or gradually? For a long time, the dominant assumption was gradual, small steps, incremental improvements, tens of thousands of years of slow refinement. But a growing number of researchers now argue for something closer to a rapid emergence, at least for the specific structural rules that make human language what it is. Linguist Derek Bickerton spent much of his career studying what happens when people without a shared language are forced to communicate, specifically in the formation of Creole languages. When adult speakers of different languages are thrown together, they typically develop a simplified pidgin, functional but grammatically limited. But when children grow up exposed to that pidgin, something remarkable happens. Within a single generation, the children spontaneously add grammatical structure that didn't exist in what they were taught. Bickerton studied this directly in Hawaii, documenting how the children of pidgin-speaking plantation workers in the early 20th century developed Hawaiian Creole, a fully grammatical language, essentially from scratch, in one generation. This has been observed elsewhere too. Researchers studying Nicaraguan Sign Language in the 1980s watched something almost identical happen in real time. Deaf children, brought together in a new school with no shared sign language, invented one. The first cohort produced a crude system of gestures. The younger children who learned from them spontaneously added consistent grammar, recursive structure, and rules that no one had explicitly taught them. Linguist Judy Kegel, who documented this extensively starting in the late 1980s, described watching an entire language essentially assemble itself within a decade, driven almost entirely by children. That detail matters enormously for the origin of language, because it suggests the human brain isn't just capable of learning language, it's almost compelled to build grammatical structure, even when none is provided. If you put humans in a situation where communication is necessary and no shared system exists, a language-shaped hole gets filled, fast, and mostly by children, which raises a genuinely wild possibility. The first true human language might not have been slowly negotiated by adults over millennia. It might have emerged, in something closer to real time, in a single generation of children, the way Nicaraguan Sign Language did, once the biological capacity for recursive grammar was fully in place. So when did that biological capacity arrive? This is the least settled part of the story, and different lines of evidence point in different directions. The FOXP2 data suggests the core hardware may have existed 500,000 years ago or more, shared with Neanderthals. The symbolic behavior at Blombos Cave suggests complex shared communication was functioning by at least 73,000 years ago. Some researchers, including archaeologist Ian Tattersall, have proposed a narrower, more specific window, arguing that the earliest solid evidence for the kind of symbolic explosion associated with full language, cave art, elaborate burial, complex tools, clusters tightly around 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, a period sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or, more controversially, the Great Leap Forward, a term coined by Jared Diamond. Under this view, the biological capacity for language may have existed for a long time before something, a single mutation, a threshold population size, a change in social complexity, finally triggered its full use. Which brings us to a theory that reframes the entire question. What if language wasn't invented to describe the physical world at all? What if it was invented to manage other people? Anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who also gave us Dunbar's number, the cognitive limit on stable social relationships we've covered before, proposed something called the social grooming hypothesis. In primate groups, physical grooming, picking through fur, removing parasites, serves a crucial social function. It builds trust, reinforces alliances, and maintains group cohesion. But grooming has a hard limit. You can only groom one individual at a time, and it takes real time to do. Dunbar's argument, published across multiple papers starting in the 1990s, is that as early human groups grew larger, grooming stopped being an efficient way to maintain that many relationships. Language, Dunbar argues, evolved as a kind of vocal grooming. You can talk to several people at once. You can maintain a relationship with someone who isn't even in the room, just by discussing them. Under this theory, the earliest and most important function of language wasn't hunting coordination or tool-making instructions. It was gossip, tracking who did what, who could be trusted, who broke an alliance, who's worth cooperating with. Which means, if Dunbar is right, some of the very first sentences ever spoken by a human being were probably about other people, whether they behaved well or badly, whether they could be trusted. In other words, the first language may have been invented, essentially, for gossip. There's a competing theory worth mentioning, sometimes called the man-the-hunter hypothesis, which suggests language emerged primarily to coordinate group hunting, since that requires planning, timing, and shared understanding of a plan that hasn't happened yet, something almost no other species is capable of. Both theories are probably partly right. Complex coordinated hunting and complex social tracking likely reinforced each other. A group that could gossip effectively could also plan effectively, and the cognitive tools underlying both are strikingly similar. You need to model what's in someone else's head, whether that's their intentions in an ambush or their intentions in a betrayal. There's one more piece of this that deserves attention, because it might be the strangest of all. Once you have language, even a very basic version, you gain access to something no other known species has, the ability to talk about things that don't exist. Not just the tree over there, but the tree we planted last year, the tree we might plant next year, the tree in the story about the ancestor who planted the first tree. This capacity, sometimes called displaced reference, the ability to communicate about things removed from the immediate here and now, may be the single most consequential feature of human language. It's the foundation of planning, of storytelling, of religion, of law, of every abstract institution humans have ever built. A wolf can warn another wolf about a threat that is happening right now. As far as we know, no wolf has ever warned another wolf about a threat that might happen next winter, based on a pattern observed 3 winters ago, using a shared symbolic system that both wolves learned from someone else entirely. That specific capability, displaced, abstract, transmissible communication, is arguably the actual moment humanity as we understand it began. Not fire, not tools, that. So how did humans invent the first language? The honest, current, best-supported answer looks something like this. The biological hardware, the vocal anatomy, the specific neural wiring involving genes like FOXP2 likely existed in some form over 500,000 years ago, shared with our Neanderthal cousins. The clearest archaeological evidence of complex shared symbolic systems, ochre engravings, beads, long-distance trade, appears solidly by 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. And the actual grammatical explosion, the recursive structure that makes human language what it is, may have emerged far faster than anyone assumed, the way it did with Nicaraguan Sign Language. Once the right social conditions, a growing group size, a need to track relationships, a need to coordinate complex plans, pushed a population past some invisible threshold. It probably wasn't invented by any one person. There was no first genius who sat down and designed grammar. It was almost certainly assembled the way Nicaraguan Sign Language was assembled, collectively, unconsciously, generation by generation, mostly by children who took whatever fragmentary communication their parents were using and, without even realizing they were doing anything remarkable,
turned it into something with rules. And the strangest part of all of this is that you are still running that same system right now. Every sentence you've understood in this video, every embedded clause, every reference to something that isn't in front of you, ancient humans who lived thousands of generations before writing existed, before agriculture, before cities, built the cognitive architecture that makes that possible. They weren't trying to build Shakespeare. They were probably just trying to figure out who could be trusted, and what happened over the ridge, and whether the fire needed more wood. And somewhere in that effort, without anyone planning it, they built the single most powerful piece of technology our species has ever produced.